Hey guys, welcome back. Hopefully you had a really positive experience shooting that first assignment. And I do want to say that if you didn't shoot the assignment, stop the video and go shoot the freaking assignment. Because you are not going to learn, you're not going to master the content if you don't go and do. You have to learn and then you have to go apply it. You have to do it. If you don't, then you're not going to learn the content. So if you haven't shot it, stop the video, go shoot the assignment, come back, and let's get rolling on this. If you have shot the assignment, that's wonderful. Hopefully you had a really great experience. I would imagine that as you went out there and shot, that after you looked at your photos, you probably noticed that some of them turned out great. The exposure looked really nice. Others were maybe a little dark, and others were a little bit too light. And then some of them were probably blurry. In this video today, we are going to dive a little bit deeper into exposure and talk about maybe why that is. Why did some of them turn out light? Why did some of them turn out dark? And why were some of them blurry? So with that said, let's go ahead and dive into this lesson. We are going to start today by talking about the 3 exposure controls, which we've already talked a little bit about, but we're going to dive into these a little bit more. And those controls are aperture, shutter speed, and ISO. So let's take a look at what those do. All right, so the first thing that we need to talk about here is what exactly is the aperture, shutter speed, and ISO, and how do those impact exposure? So I want to take a minute to go through this chart here and just talk to you about what this chart means. So the first thing that we need to talk about is aperture. Aperture is basically the size of the hole through which light passes on your camera. And the way that aperture works with regards to this chart is the smaller the number, the bigger the hole. And that's why I've laid out these circles in the way I've laid them out. So f2.0 is going to be a large opening. We go all the way to the right on f22, and you're going to have a very small opening. Now, each of these numbers, like I said, it is either going to double the amount of light or it's going to half the amount of light. So, for example, if we keep in mind that f2.0 is a very large opening and the hole is getting smaller and smaller as I change the number here, each of those numbers is going to half the amount of light as I move from left to right. So f2.0, if I change my aperture from f2.0 to f2.8, I've just let in 1/2 the amount of light as I did previously. From 2.8 to f4, I've let in half the amount of light from f2.8 and 1/4 the amount of light from f2.0. So it's important that you remember these numbers because on your camera, you're going to have other numbers like from f11, you might have an f12 and an f13.5 and then an f16. So it's important for you to know which is the full stop number so you can know when have I cut the amount of light by half, when have I doubled it, and when am I somewhere in between there. So again, memorize those numbers. Next, we move down to shutter speed. Shutter speed is basically, there's a little shutter. It's like a window or some blinds on your camera that when you push the shutter release, that shutter, those blinds, open up and then they close. So the shutter speed here describes how long is that going to be open for. So on the left, where we're talking about more light coming through the camera, I've got 2 seconds. That means it opens, 1 Mississippi, 2 Mississippi, it closes. If we go all the way down to the right, 60. Now you'll notice I don't have the little quotation marks because that is 1/60th of a second. In your camera, if the quotations show up, that means you're talking about seconds. If there are no quotes, then you're in fractions of a second. So down here, we're talking 1/60th of a second. That's really fast. So the shutter is open for an extremely short time, allowing less light to come through. And each of these numbers, again, are the full stop numbers. In other words, each of these numbers lets in half the amount of light, or it'll double the light if you go from right to left. So if I go from 1/30th to 1/15th, I've doubled the amount of light that's getting into the camera, hitting the film plane or the the digital sensor in the back. If I go from 15 to 1/8 of a second, again, I have doubled it, or I've quadrupled it from the 30. So that's shutter speed. Last of all, we have the film speed, or the ISO. This is basically the sensitivity of the chip in our camera as it relates to, the light coming through. So where I've got a large number, 3200 ISO, is going to be very, very sensitive to light, which means I need very little light to properly expose that. As I move from left to right and I get down to 25, now it's much less sensitive to light. So I'm going to need a ton of light to come through to properly expose it. And again, these numbers are the full stop numbers, which means if I go from 25 to 50, I've doubled the amount of light. From 50 to 100, I've doubled it again. And if I go back from 100 to 50, I've cut the amount of light in half. And from 50 to 25, I've cut it in half again. And like I said with the aperture, in the ISO, you're going to have variations. You might have 400, 500, 700, and then 800. And with the shutter speeds, you're also going to, you could have 4, 5, 7, and 8, 1/8 of a second, and all kinds of numbers in between. And that's why it's important that you memorize the full stop numbers, because if you have them memorized, you've got a baseline to know where am I doubling and where am I halving the exposure. And all those numbers in between, you can kind of figure it out as you go. But if you don't have those full stop numbers memorized, it's going to be difficult to understand when am I doubling, when am I halving the amount of light. Okay, so again, like I said, I'm going to put this chart here on the website so you can download it, you can look at it and reference it. Yeah, and hopefully that'll serve you well. All right, the next thing that we need to talk about is middle gray. The camera's whole purpose in life, whether we like it or not, is to make everything it sees middle gray, also known as 18% gray, which is the average lightness of most scenes. Cameras are programmed to make the scene that you're composing, so when you look through the viewfinder, whatever you've framed, they are programmed to dial that in at middle gray. And the way that it does it is it looks at the scene, it analyzes it, it maybe in its mind takes all those values, whether if you're taking a picture of a guy standing there handing some flowers to a girl, and the background has got a white sky and some mountains. It takes all those values of the mountains and the sky and the flowers and mixes them all together into kind of a grayish, and then it says, okay, now what do I need to do to make this 18% gray? And then what it does is relies on you. It relies on you to look through the viewfinder and then dial the aperture and shutter speed and ISO until that little line puts the bar right in the middle, which you did in the first assignment. So once you dial that in and take a picture, it's said that that scene is about middle gray, which should result in a pretty accurate exposure, unless the entire scene is white or black, and we'll talk about that a little bit later. But the camera's whole purpose is to make everything middle gray. So let me walk you through a little analogy to hopefully better explain exposure. Here we have a picture of a couple of faucets and some glasses, and those faucets are filling it up. And within those glasses, we have a line right in the middle, and that line is going to represent middle gray, 18% gray. In other words, the picture is not too light, not too dark. The glass is not too full, not too empty. It's just right. On the right, you can see that if we have a very small opening on the faucet and we turn it on, then that fill time is going to take a long time to fill that glass up. Same with a photograph. You hold your camera up, you dial in the aperture, and you've got a really, really small aperture, so very little light is coming through. Well, therefore, to get a good exposure, to fill the bucket to where it needs to be filled, or the glass to where it needs to be filled, you have to leave the faucet open for a long time. Or, like your shutter speed in your camera, you have to open the shutter speed for a long time if you have a very small aperture, depending on the light conditions, which we'll talk about later. On the right here, you can see that we've got a very large opening on our faucet, which means when I crank that sucker open, it's going to blast out water and the fill time is going to be very quick. just like in the camera. If you have a very large aperture and you open the shutter speed, light's going to come flooding through there, and so you only have to have that shutter open for just a fraction of a second before the glass is filled to the perfect line of fullness. That's how exposure works. And middle gray, like I said before, is what scientists have determined is the perfect fullness, is the best exposure for most average scenes out there. So now let's talk a little bit about, so how does the camera know what is the perfect exposure? And the way that it knows that is by using a light meter. I'm going to talk about the two types of light meters just so you understand what those are and what they do. One of them is practical, the other one is, just for your information to understand how light meters work. So the first type of meter is an incident meter. And an incident meter works by measuring the amount of light pouring off of a light source. So for example, here in this illustration, we have light pouring off of the sun, hitting the light meter. And the light meter, when you push the button, opens up and it says, okay, what do I fill? How much light do I need to fill it to the perfect line of exposure? And it comes back and it says, okay, so to fill it up, you need f16 at 1/100th of a second. That's how big the faucet needs to be, and that's how long it needs to be open for. That's how big the aperture needs to be, and that's how long the shutter needs to be open for. Gives you that number, and then you can go ahead and anything that light is shining on in that scene, you can dial your exposure and walk away with a really nicely exposed shot. Now let's talk about reflective meters. Reflective meters work a little bit different. A reflective meter is basically the type of meter that exists inside of your camera, and it doesn't necessarily measure the amount of light that's falling on the subject, it measures the light bouncing off. So our reflective meter here is going to measure maybe the light bouncing off of the hat, bouncing off of the snow. It's going to take these numbers here and maybe off the scarf and average those out, and it's probably going to spit out a number that's going to be pretty close to the f16 at 1/100th of a second. Because if you take f8 at 1/100th of a second and f32, right in between on those numbers, actually, why don't we go back to the chart and take a look. f8, f32. So we don't have f32 on the chart, but it's actually one stop darker than f22. So f22 is right there. f8's here. We go 1, 2, 1, 2. That takes us to f16, right in the middle. So the average is going to be about f16 of the light bouncing off of our subject, which again gives us a good exposure. Where we run into problems is if I was just focusing on the hat or just focusing on the snow of the snowman's butt, I would get a completely different exposure. And we'll talk about how to deal with that a little bit later. But just know, two types of meters, one that measures the light falling off of a subject or off of the light source, the other one that measures the light bouncing off of the subject. And that is the type of meter that you have in your camera. So with that said, let's take a look at the different meter settings that exist in your camera. So here are the 4 different common meter types. The first one, and you may have, depending on your camera, you may have all 4 of these, you may just have one. So you're going to have to consult your user guide to find out what meter types, what meter settings you have available to you in your camera. So the first one is an area meter, and basically what this does, it looks at the entire frame, smushes it all together, averages it out, and gives you a shutter speed and ISO setting, or shutter speed and aperture setting based on whatever your ISO is set at. The center weighted meter was basically developed because most amateur photographers throw their subject right in the middle of the frame. And we're going to talk a little bit later in our composition video about how to compose a good shot. But when it comes to center weighted meters, just understand that basically it's looking at what's in the center and ignoring around the edges there to come up with the right exposure. The spot meter is a little bit more advanced exposure meter control. The spot meter measures a very small area in your camera, which allows the photographer to point the camera at different regions in the photo analyze what the shutter speed and ISO are and come up with their own determination as to what they think would be the best shutter speed and aperture to use. So when you're selecting which meter type to use, you probably want to avoid the spot meter until you become a little bit more proficient at using your camera to get a good exposure and understanding meters. The last meter type is the matrix or evaluative meter. And the way that this works is that it typically divides your frame up into different regions and then analyzes what's in each of these regions values-wise, and then runs through some algorithms to determine what would be the best exposure. When you're just starting off, if this is available in your camera, this is probably the best meter to use. It's going to be the most accurate over the other 3 types of meters. If you don't have that, then I would probably next go with the area meter, and then last of all with the spot meter. Center weighted, most likely you can ignore that. Those are the different meter types. Now that you understand meter types, get out your camera, see what you've got available to you, and make a determination as to which one may be the best meter type to use. All right, now let's get into the nitty-gritty here. What we've really come to learn, and that is how to manipulate our exposures and fine-tune those so we can get them exactly the way that we want them. So I want to talk now about equivalent exposures. Equivalent exposures, just like it implies, the name implies, equivalent is the same. It's the same exposure, only using different settings in your camera. The way that it works is, if you look here, highlighted in green, we have the initial exposure that our camera recommended as we dialed our dials and got that little bar right to the middle. So it's saying f5.6 at 1/15 of a second. Okay, I snap the picture, and this is what I get, the shot in the middle. Now, the beauty of equivalent exposures is that I can take the different settings of my camera, I can play around with aperture and shutter speed and adjust those settings and come up with the equivalent exposure, the exact same exposure. Now, you may ask, why in the world would you want to do that? I mean, if you dialed it in and you got a good exposure, why would you want to change the aperture and the shutter speed? Well, the reason why you would want to do that, and it'll make more sense a little bit later on, is that aperture and shutter speed don't just control exposure, but they also control some creative aspects of photography, of the shots we're taking. Aperture, for example, will control the range of focus, whether it's a very, very narrow range of focus or a really wide range of focus. And shutter speed, when we're photographing a moving object, will control whether or not that object is in sharp focus and frozen in midair, or whether there's some blur to that object as it's moving. So that's the reason why we would want to create an equivalent exposure. I dial in my exposure and I'm like, I don't know if I really want to use that aperture. I can adjust my aperture, and then I can adjust my shutter speed and create an equivalent exposure. So the way that it works is that my camera, first of all, gives me a recommendation. I dial it in, it's saying f5.6 at 1/15 of a second. To create an equivalent, I basically have to go lighter with one setting and darker with another. So if I go from f5.6 to f8, I've closed my aperture down, making the shot a little bit darker. So I have to compensate for that by slowing my shutter speed down so that it lets in more light. So I go from 1/15 to f8, I've let twice the amount of light in, and I've cut the amount of light in half with the aperture, and I've created an equivalent exposure. I can go more if I want, so I can go from f5.6 to f2.8. Well, I've just doubled and then doubled again the amount of light. I've gone 4 times the amount of light, so I need to go let 4 times less the amount of light in with the shutter speed. So I go from 15th to a 30th to a 60th of a second. And I've let the equal, I've gone 1/4 the amount of light with the shutter speed and 4 times with the aperture, which balances itself out and creates an equivalent exposure. That's how equivalent exposures work. Let's take a look at this in the camera sim so you can get a sense of how this is going to work when you're actually out there shooting in the field. All right, so here we are now over in the camera sim. I've framed my shot. I've dialed my numbers until I've got that little bar right in the middle, and it's recommending that I shoot at f8 at 1/25th of a second. So I'll go ahead and snap it, and beautiful shot. The camera has done its job. This is an average scene. It mixed the colors together and said, you know, this is middle gray. So let's head back now and create an equivalent exposure. To do that, I'm going to select either my shutter speed and aperture and go ahead and adjust that number. So I'm currently at f8. I'm going to adjust in full stop numbers. You don't have to do that, but I recommend it because you're going to see more of a difference as you go in full stops than if you go in third stops or half stops. Now I say third and half, those numbers are going to vary from camera to camera. You need to consult the manual in your camera or just look in your camera and find out, are there two numbers in between the full stop numbers that are on the list that I gave you, the chart that I gave you, or is there one number, or are there no numbers? If there's three numbers, you've got third stops. So you've got the full stops and you've got third stops. Those adjustments, if I were to go darker by a third or 2/3, you're going to see a very minimal change. If I go in half stops, you'll see a little change. You're going to see a lot more of a change going in full stops. So that's why I recommend adjusting in full stop increments. Okay, so let's jump back here now to the camera sim. So I'm going to adjust my aperture a full stop in one direction. So from f8 to f5.6. Now that has gone lighter. f5.6 is a bigger hole, and that lets in more light. So in order to compensate for the fact that I've just made it too bright, I have to, with the other setting, the shutter speed, make it too dark. 1/25th of a second. Am I going to go 1/250th or am I going to go 1/60th? What do you think? A little darker. 1/250th of a second. So let's dial it up there. 1/250th. And voila, we're right in the middle. Let's take our shot. And it looks identical. We've created an equivalent exposure. Now, let me walk you through a scenario. Let's say you're out there and you go ahead and you dial in your exposure and you get some crazy number in between those full stop numbers. So I got f4.5 at 1/400th of a second. And you're going, I don't know what to do. It's not on the chart. It's not on the chart. Don't panic. Here's what you do. First of all, figure out whether your camera operates in third stop or half stop increments. And then you can go ahead and adjust. So let's say you got a little dial on your camera that you have to click it 1, 2, 3 times to go from one full stop number to another full stop number. So what I'm going to do then is take my aperture and move it 1, 2, 3 in one direction, making that basically right now I went, let's see what I do. I went darker. That means I need to go lighter on my shutter. So I'm going to click 1, 2, 1, 2, 3. There we go. And it's put it back in the middle. So I can always look to the middle to know that I've got an equivalent exposure, but it's good to know how many clicks do I need to take the aperture, how many clicks do I need to take the shutter speed, and to know whether or not you're going in the right direction or not. The only way to do that is to pull out that chart, memorize those numbers, and understand what they do. Does from going f8 to f11 make it brighter or darker? You need to know that. Does going from 1/60th of a second to 1/30th make it brighter or darker? Learn that, memorize it, and it'll make this process a lot easier. And then understand whether or not your camera is operating in third stop or full stop increments or half stop increments. So you adjust it right to make sure you're going a full stop one direction or a full stop the other direction, that you're on those full stop numbers. All right. That said, now let's go ahead and jump back over to the slide and talk about bracketing. So bracketing is basically taking your shot, your good exposure, and intentionally making it too dark or too light. To bracket, the way that it works is the camera, of course, is going to give you a recommendation for middle gray, for the perfect exposure. So here we have in this example, it's recommended f5.6 at 1/15th of a second. I shoot the shot and we get a good exposure. If I want to make that darker or brighter intentionally, what I have to do is adjust either the aperture or the shutter speed, but leave one of those intact where it started initially. So if I want to make my shot a little bit lighter, I leave at 1/15 of a second fixed, and I go from 5.6 to f4.0. I open the aperture, and that lets more light in, but I don't touch the shutter speed, so I have a brighter shot. If I want to go darker, I go from f5.6 to f8, leave it at f15 or 1/15 of a second, and I've gone darker. Now I can reverse this and leave 5.6 fixed, but go from 1/15 of a second to f8, or 1/15 of a second to 1/8 of a second. Sorry about that. And that's slowed the shutter speed and let more light in. Or I can speed the shutter up and go from 15 to 1/30th of a second, leaving f5.6 where it is, and I've got a darker shot. Now you may wonder, well, why would I ever want to do that? Because, if I get a good exposure, I get a good exposure. Well, there are some scenarios that we're going to walk through in a minute where you have to do that to get a good exposure, because the camera, like I said, wants to make everything middle gray. It wants to make it gray, but there are some scenes that are not all gray. If I'm shooting a white wall, I don't want it to be gray. I want it to be white. And also, there are some cameras that, even though it says it's right in the middle, when you actually pull the shots up on your computer at home, you'll notice that what you thought was a good exposure really should have been a little bit lighter. So those are some scenarios where you may want to bracket. With that said, before we jump into some of these tricky situations, let me talk a little bit about the minimum handheld shutter speed. What the minimum handheld shutter speed is basically the minimum shutter speed that you can shoot your shot with, given the type of lens that you're using, and not have blur from the camera shaking. If you shake the camera and the shutter is open too long, it's going to be blurry. So the minimum handheld shutter speed is the recommendation given the lens you're using for which shutter speed you need to use if you're holding the camera by hand. If the shutter speed drops below the minimum handheld shutter speed, you need to slap it on a tripod and lock it down, because otherwise your shot is going to turn out most likely blurry. Now, the reason why I want to bring this up is because the worst thing out there is to go and you shoot the most unbelievable shot ever. The light's great, composition looks beautiful. You pull it up on your computer and it's awkwardly blurry. And that is extremely disheartening. So I want to give you this tool so that when you go out and you're shooting this assignment, you keep that in mind so you don't walk away with a whole repertoire of, blurry, nasty pictures you're going to have to throw away. So here's how it works. Minimum handheld shutter speed. If your lens is something like a 400 millimeter lens, you got a really huge telephoto lens, then your minimum handheld shutter speed is 1 over the focal length, which is 400. 1/400th of a second is your minimum handheld shutter speed. If your recommendation when you're dialing in your exposure is 1/250th of a second, you've got a 400 millimeter lens, it's going to be blurry. So let's say you dial in, you got a 400 millimeter lens, you try to dial in 400, but there's no 400 in your shutter speed settings. What do? Well, what you do is just go to the next number that's bigger than 400. So maybe my camera doesn't have a 400, but it's got 1/500th of a second and 1/250th of a second. 250, smaller than 400, don't do it. Go to 500. And that's how you determine the minimum handheld shutter speed. So here are a couple of recommendations based on some different lens types. If you've got a 50 millimeter lens, 1/50th of a second. There's no 50th of a second on my camera, so I'm going to go to 1/60th of a second. Hopefully that makes sense. Use it, do it, because I don't want you to have a great shot that's blurry that you can't really blow up because it looks horrible when you blow it up. All right. Last thing we need to talk about in this lesson. Tricky situations, difficult exposure situations. So let's say you go out and as part of this assignment, you're going to have to shoot low key and high key images. Low key means everything in the frame is dark or black, has really dark values and tones to it. High key is everything is really light, a lot of light tones and colors, or it's all white. That's a high key, that's a low key. Well, if I'm shooting this dog, for example, black against black, I hold my frame up there, the camera, I dial it into where the little notch is right in the middle, where the perfect exposure is, and I shoot it. What's going to happen to this? What is the camera trying to do? Its whole purpose in life is to make everything middle gray. This dog in that background gray is basically an overexposed shot. It's too bright. Gray is too bright. It's not black. So I need to use those bracketing skills and force it to underexpose so that I can have it looking like this, like it really does. Same thing with the swan here. I fill the frame with the swan. I dial it right to the middle. This thing is going to be middle gray, and that's way too dark for this light scene. So I have to overexpose it, force it to overexpose, because the camera is going to be saying, no, don't do it. You're going way too bright because this needs to be gray. Don't listen to the camera. Look at your scene, and if it's too light, overexpose it to make it white. We're going to go through this in the assignment. So those are some difficult situations, and those are what you do to adjust to high key and to low key shots. All right, with that said, now let's jump over to the assignment, walk you through it, and then I want you out there. I want you going out, and I want you to shoot this assignment. Do not move on to the next lesson without shooting that darn assignment, because you remember, you got to learn and then you got to do. Otherwise, you're just, you're not going to learn the content. So let's take a look at the assignment. Okay. We're going to take a quick review over this assignment, and then we're going to turn you loose. So in most scenes, auto exposure works pretty darn good. However, there are times and places where auto exposure will completely and utterly fail you. So in these cases, it's good to know the skills that you now have, the knowledge that you have that will turn into a skill once you get out and shoot, so that you can compensate for these more challenging situations. Additionally, one of the biggest hesitations that new photographers have is getting in close to their subject. Getting in close is going to dramatically improve your images, but a lot of people are really afraid to get close to people or objects or whatever. So the challenge here is to get in close. So what happens is that basically when you don't move in close, you get an image that results in a lot of distracting background elements that end up drawing your attention away from the primary subject that's being photographed. And it just creates a lot of clutter. It's not as great of an image. So for this assignment, your challenge is to fill the entire frame with your subject. Now, I don't mean you take a ball and you make it fit exactly within the frame of your camera. No, I want you to go even closer. Fill the frame and do some fun things. Just move close, show part of the object, the whole object, a little bit of the object. Move around and play with your composition as you move in close. So now let's talk about what you're going to master in this assignment. First of all, you're going to master bracketing. I want you to really play with bracketing and think about it as you go out and shoot the assignment. Actually, what I want you to do is pre-visualize. So before you just, dial it in, shoot, and say, ooh, it made it light, or ooh, it made it dark. What I want you to do is dial it in, say, this is going to make it lighter. This is going to make it darker. Then shoot it and see if you were right. If you're wrong, then, try again next time and see what happens. But try to call it before you shoot it. You're going to learn better that way. You're going to master exposing for high and low key scenes. And last of all, you're going to overcome that fear of invading personal space when taking a picture. So the assignment checklist. Part 1 is bracketing a normal subject. Just an everyday, average run-of-the-mill scene that the camera is going to say, this should be middle gray, and it's going to be right. You're going to go out and shoot a scene like that. One, doing what the camera recommends, and then overriding that and going 1 stop too dark and 1 stop too light. Full stops. Make sure you don't go third and you don't go half. Go full stop so you can see the difference. If you go a third stop, you're not going to really see much of a difference, if any at all. Next is part 2, high key and low key subjects. So I want you to find a subject that's all light or white, that has just lighter values in it. Fill the frame so that everything in that frame when you look at it is light or a very light value. And then go ahead and shoot it. Shoot it what the camera recommends, and then I want you to overexpose 1 stop and overexpose 2 stops. Again, try to call it. So you're going to say, okay, I am now overexposing, click, and if it looks darker, you're like, oops, I made a mistake. Try it again until you can recall what it is you're doing. Next, you're going to find several low-key subjects or objects. So basically, you're going to fill the frame with objects where everything in the frame is either dark or black, really dark values. And then you're going to shoot it with what the camera recommends. And then you're going to go 1 stop too dark. And then you're going to go 2 stops too dark. And then you're going to see which one looks the best. Once you've gone and you've shot several examples of part 1 and part 2, I want you then to do this reflection. So take a look at your shots and ask yourselves, why do some shots look better than others? I noticed that maybe you noticed that -1 or +1 is always better than normal for some reason. Why is that? Spend some time trying to figure out what happened. Why is it? Is it the camera falling apart? Is it the subject, an issue with the subject? Is it just me? What is it? What's causing that? And last of all, ask yourself how moving in closer impacted your images from last assignment to this assignment. Did you find that moving a little bit closer resulted in better images? One last thing too, the second page of this assignment is an exposure log. Use it. It's kind of a pain to use it, but it's a great resource. If you write down every shot you take, a description, the aperture you use, the shutter speed, and notes. I was overexposing one. This was +1, -1, +2, -2, normal. Write that down in the bracketing notes. Then when you come to this reflection part and you're like, oh man, everything always turned out better +1 or -1. Well, you can go through these notes and say, okay, yeah, that's right, because I can tell here I used +1 and it looked great because I noted it here. Or you might be sitting there scratching your head. I have no idea why this didn't turn out. You check your notes and you're like, oh, well, duh. I messed up on my exposure here and I messed up on my guess. So if you use your notes, you're going to be able to troubleshoot the reflection a lot easier. All right, you know what? I think we've covered everything we need to cover in exposure. Again, go out, shoot the assignment, and have fun with it. You should be having fun with each of these assignments. Just go shoot whatever you want, and yeah, we'll see you on the next lesson. Oh, and I will say that we've done some pretty tedious stuff between this first lesson and the second lesson. Now we're going to get into some of the more fun, creative components of your camera and how you work those. So we'll see you over in the next lesson.